We'd like to hear about your story. Can you tell us about the beginning of your career? How did you discover your interest in neuropsychology and pediatric psychology?
So when I first went to undergraduate, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but then I started taking psychology courses and really enjoyed them. Was lucky to be at a school that had some very well-known psychologists on the faculty. The department head at that point was Ulrich Neisser, who's sort of the father of cognitive psychology. So a lot of good faculty, a lot of good professors got really interested and decided to apply to graduate school in clinical psychology. When I got to graduate school, I kind of got lucky and got a fellowship in developmental psychology, working in research on kids that had sort of poor, disadvantaged backgrounds and intervention programs to help them. So I got really interested in sort of the child or pediatric side of things, but I really didn't get exposed to neuropsychology until I went on internship. So in the United States, which is where I did my training, if you get a PhD in clinical psychology, you spend a whole year on a full-time clinical internship. And it was during that internship that I met Jane Bernstein, who's the former head of the neuropsychology program at Boston Children's Hospital. And that's sort of where I started to sort of fall in love with neuropsychology. There weren't all the formal training programs in neuropsychology that there are now. So you sort of, a lot of us got into it sort of sideways and got our training in various ways like I did. So yeah, it just sort of grew from there. And I kept finding different opportunities to get different types of training and continuing education and all that. And just have always been really interested in the brain and how it relates to behavior.
Thank you. And our second question is, you have worked so many years on concussions and traumatic brain injury in children. Of course, you worked interdisciplinary because of the subject. So what is the predominant role of neuropsychologists in diagnosis, treatment, and evaluation processes?
Yeah, it's changed some over the years. I think neuropsychologists played a little bit bigger role in diagnosis in many years ago because we didn't have imaging. With the advent of CT scans and then MRI, neuropsychologists play a smaller role in diagnosis of the injury itself now, although they clearly play a major role in assessing the cognitive or social or emotional problems that go along with traumatic brain injury. Neuropsychologists probably still play a bit of a diagnostic role in concussion because there's no imaging doesn't help with that. There's no objective biomarker yet for concussion. So neuropsychologists do get involved in diagnostically in concussion. With more severe traumatic brain injury, though, our role is more evaluative. I do think neuropsychologists have increasingly sort of circled back to getting more involved in intervention or treatment or rehabilitation as we've gotten more evidence that rehabilitation or treatment works for patients with traumatic brain injury, and also because the old traditional role that the neuropsychologist only did testing and only did assessment has started to change somewhat as well. There are still certainly neuropsychologists, all they do is assessment, but I think there's a growing number that combine both assessment and treatment in the clinical work they do.
Thank you for your answer. What are the main differences between concussions in children and concussions in adults in terms of process management?
Yeah, there's differences in the nature of the injury and how it occurs. There's probably differences in outcomes, and then there are certainly differences in terms of managing it. So if we go back to the injury itself, the mechanisms of injury in kids tend to be predominantly either falls in younger children or sport, recreation related sorts of mechanisms in school age children. In adults, that's sport and rec still is significant and falls still fit in there, but motor vehicle accidents probably are a little bit more common. The biomechanics are different because you're dealing with a kid whose head is bigger relative to their body than adults. And so the head moves differently. The brain tissue is slightly different. So the mechanism is different, the biomechanics are different, and probably the underlying brain is different. And probably as a consequence of that, I think there's a little bit of data to suggest that recovery from concussion is a little bit slower in children on average than it is in adults. But I think the biggest difference in management probably has to do with the fact, with kids, you're always dealing with a family environment, and you're dealing with a school environment, and sort of these multiple sets of kids that are situated in context with other adults that they depend on. Adults are also in a context, but it's not quite the same as having parents and others who sort of have to take care of you, at least for concussion. The big thing for kids that's different from adults in management also is that, we're concerned about returning to school. That's always a big issue in terms of how quickly do they go back to school? Do they have any short-term problems adjusting back to school after a concussion? In some cases, longer-term issues. With adults, of course, it's return to work. So it's a little different than what you're dealing with return to school. And then with kids, a lot of them, you have to also go through the return to play or return to sport process as well. So I think we tend to be a bit more cautious with children than with adults, not wanting to take the risk of any long-term sorts of difficulties. And I think we have to spend more time consulting with the adults that play a big role in their lives, their parents, their teachers, to make sure that the environment is set up to make their return to all their activities to be as successful as they can be.
Thank you for your answer. It must be very difficult to work on children, but
I think it's easier. kids are more honest than adults. So yes. Kids will just tell you what's going on. I've always found kids, they're a little bit more challenging from a neuropsychological perspective because their brains are going through so many developmental changes. But in terms of working with them, I actually like working with kids more.
It's very great. And our other question is, you also work on psychosocial outcomes after TBI and other brain disorders. How does TBI affect psychosocial development in children? What intervention methods are you working on?
Yeah, so I have been involved in work on what happens to kids socially after a variety of different types of brain disorders, particularly TBI, but we've also studied kids with stroke, and we studied kids with brain tumors, and so a variety of brain disorders. In kids with TBI in particular, what we found is that the kids tend to be more socially isolated. They tend to have fewer friends than kids without TBI. And we're talking about kids with moderate to severe TBI here. This isn't kids with concussion. So kids with more severe TBI, they tend to be more socially isolated. They have fewer friends. They tend to be sort of rejected or victimized by other kids. So it's not just that they don't have friends, but they're often kind of treated pretty badly by their peers. And of course, that has lots of downstream effects. It means that they don't do as well in school. And we have lots of research that shows that how you do socially with peers in school actually is related to your academic performance. They don't do as well down the road as adults as they move into more adult sorts of roles socially. There are a lot of negative consequences to having problems with peer relationships and social relationships. And it's a little unique to TBI in that when we've looked at these other groups, they have some difficulties socially too. I think the biggest difference is the TBI, at least more severe TBI, is a very diffuse injury. It sort of compromises the entire brain, but it also tends to predominantly affect frontal and temporal regions. And we know that the frontal and temporal regions are pretty involved in regulation of behavior, but also in sort of social perceptiveness and the ability to interact with other people effectively. And so it may be that TBI has a particularly negative effect on social relationships because of the actual nature of the underlying injury. But the second part of your question about what intervention methods, I have to say that I haven't been involved yet in any studies specifically looking at interventions socially, and there's a real need for more of those. There's very few studies out there that have tried to figure out how we can actually help kids with social problems after TBI. There are a few studies that sort of try to address that question. But I think part of the reason for that is if you look at the broader research on how to promote social development, it's not easy to do in any population. There's not a lot of empirically proven treatments to promote social development. And many of them involve sort of changing a whole environment. So social emotional learning sorts of programs that are done in the schools where they're promoting social well-being, requires a much broader sort of type of intervention than just trying to work with the individual kid. And, it makes sense that social intervention would be tricky because if a kid is sitting with an adult and the adult's trying to help them socially, they're not actually interacting socially with the ones that are most important, which are their peers. So you need to find a way to train social behavior and promote appropriate social behavior that probably involves interactions with peers. And that's, again, harder to structure. So I sort of did a lot of that work, and we were going to head in the direction of intervention, but then I moved to Canada and took my position up here and really started focusing on concussion. So I haven't pursued treatment research in that area, but I know other people are interested in trying to figure out whether there are actual programs that would help to promote better social outcomes for kids with TBI. And I think there's enough evidence now to suggest there might be some ways to do that, but people need to do the research.
Okay, thank you. And in addition, you have also considerable editorial experiences. There are some concepts what we emphasize within the scope of scientific publishing, especially open science, transparency, inclusivity, diversity. Can you talk about the importance of these concepts for students who are future others?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that both the science we do and who does the science and who judges the science needs to become more inclusive. In terms of advice to students, I think one of the most important things about the whole movement towards more inclusivity and transparency is partly to be more thoughtful about what participants are in your research. I mean, traditionally, a lot of research in the Western world has been done on undergraduates. And while they're an interesting group, they're a very select group of people. Sometimes even our studies of clinical populations, for example, only or include almost entirely white, often sometimes only male, kind of limited, not very representative samples. So if we're going to make our science applicable more broadly worldwide, we need to really pay attention to who's actually participating. And that's a problem because it's pretty well documented that in a lot of the science, we have the hardest time recruiting or keeping people in the studies who are from less advantaged backgrounds. So we have to work extra hard to try to get a more representative sample. The other thing that's really going to affect younger scientists who want to be authors is the whole move to open data and open access and more transparency. So we're increasingly encouraging scientists to publish a protocol paper or a paper that says, this is the study I'm going to do, and here's what I plan to do, and this is how we're going to do it. Because then you can look back when they submit a paper and say, yep, they did what they said they were going to do. They're reporting all their data. They're not selectively reporting their data and only reporting the stuff that turned out statistically significant. They're reporting everything. So we have to get in a habit of get students in the habit of thinking about, okay, these are what my hypotheses are. These are what my methods are going to be. And certainly when you do science, sometimes things have to change a bit, but it's really important to document what you thought you were going to do and then be able to document why you might have changed something rather than that all happening in the background and nobody seeing anything about how that process occurred. So in the journal I edit, Neuropsychology, we've actually now have a specific section in the papers that we expect people to put in called Open See and Transparency. where they report, whether or not the data is available to the public or in some repository, whether they pre-registered their study. So did they actually publish their study protocol or put it in a preprint someplace so we can compare? Do they make their code for their analyses available? These are all things that, when I was a younger scientist, that was just never the case. You just you published your stuff. Nobody had access to your data. Nobody could validate your analyses. It wouldn't be kind of unheard of, but that's really changing. I think increasingly, partly because funding agencies are demanding it. We're gonna have to make our data available for people to use. We're gonna have to be able to show people, here's the code we used for the analyses we did. You're welcome to try to validate or verify that it's right. So it's all for the good. Neuropsychology has had a real replication crisis. We're not alone in that, but a lot of our findings don't stand up when somebody does them again, because sometimes it's hard to tell what somebody did. So I think it's all for the good, or mostly for the good. There are costs because there's some evidence that making data available lets people perhaps use the data in not the ways you would want it used. And also it's costly. It costs money to find places to put all that data, to store all that data. So actually there's some evidence that maybe authors, young scientists who have less funding and maybe have less privilege or advantage, find it harder to be able to get their data put in, because all these steps take time and money. So it's a good aspiration to have open science and transparency, but I think we have to be aware of some of the unintended consequences it might have and try to figure out how to minimize those. But we really do, I think a lot of this will come from also being more inclusive in who we have doing our science. So as we encourage a broader range of students to get into psychology, we'll get better representation of who's doing the science. And I think that's going to lead to better representation of who the science is done with, and probably more transparency, certainly probably, more replicability of the science, being able to have some confidence that the findings will stand up if somebody does the same study again.
Thank you again. And so what do you think about the development and future of neuropsychology?
I don't know. I don't have much of a crystal ball. The death of neuropsychology has been forecast by some people at different times, particularly in the States, because of issues around insurance coverage and who can practice as a neuropsychologist. I think when you take a broader perspective worldwide, there's a lot of interest in brain behavior relationships and a lot of interest in the science of neuropsychology without worrying about the clinical practice, because clinical practice in neuropsychology varies so much from country to country, region of the world to region of the world, that it's hard to make generalizations. I think the science has a long ways to go. I mean, we know so little really about the brain and how it works and how it's affected by the environment and what it does to produce development, that I think there's a big future for the science of neuropsychology. The clinical practice, I think there's a lot of people interested in working as neuropsychologists, but each country develops its own standards and its own sort of ways of training people. And that makes it sometimes hard to compare, what somebody in Turkey might be doing to somebody in Norway to somebody in the United States. So it's kind of hard to forecast, because I think it's going to be very country specific. We've seen tremendous growth in the clinical side of neuropsychology in some countries, whereas in others, it seemed like they can't get a foothold, they can't get any traction and get things moving. And I think it's going to depend on, and in some countries, neuropsychologists are really not psychologists, they're physicians. So it's really variable. I think it'll still stick around. There are relatively few clinicians that are really trained to understand both sides of things, the brain and behavior, and it helps patients understand why they have the problems they have and what their strengths are and how those can be used. And So I think there's a good future for neuropsychology as long as more bureaucratic things or turf battles between different disciplines doesn't get in the way.
Thank you again. I hope it will get better. What would you like to say to psychology students watching this interview, especially who want to work on neuropsychology in the future? Do you have any suggestion for them?
Well, I don't know a lot about Turkey's educational system, so I don't know exactly how neuropsychologists kind of get trained there. I always tell young people, do what you're passionate about, do what you love. If you're going to do something for, like I've been doing psychology for 40 years now, since graduate school. So it's like, if you're going to spend 40 years doing something, you better really like it. Don't do it because your parents say to do it. Don't do it because it looks like, oh, I might make money. Don't do it because somebody else thinks it's cool. Do it because it really gets you excited and you enjoy it, and you look forward to each day doing what you do, because otherwise work becomes work, and work should be, at least to some extent, fun. One of the things I like about psychology is I get to do lots of different things. I get to do research. I get to teach and train students. I used to do clinical work. I don't do direct clinical work anymore, but I liked that when I did it. I get to do some leadership stuff, which I like. Lots of different roles, and that's one of the nice things about psychology. But I guess the advice is do what you love and take the time to figure out what you love. I think at times we expect students when they're 18 to know what they want to do for the rest of their lives, and I don't think most 18-year-olds know what they want to do for the rest of their lives. And even if they think they do, they may turn out to be wrong. So I think it's about, doing what you're passionate about, trying different things, different areas of psychology, see what you really like. And for neuropsychology, I think it depends a lot on sort of what the training paths are, or what the scientific paths are. At least in the States and Canada, you don't really start too much in neuropsychology until a graduate level as opposed to undergraduate. But if you're interested in the brain, take some neuroscience courses, take some brain and behavior courses, and see if that gets, you're still excited about it after you actually jump into it.
Thank you very much. And do you want to add something? Do you want to say something more?
No, I was just impressed that they have such a well-organized student organization in Turkey, and it's great that there's this kind of level of enthusiasm. Of course, I couldn't read the issues that I saw because I don't speak or read Turkish, but they looked really well done. I did watch one of the interviews, and it seems like you're getting a nice response. I hope other people agree to be parts of these interviews. I think it's great to spread the word kind of around the world and get more students interested in psychology. So well done.
Thank you very much. It was very inspiring talking with you. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much again. And
bye-bye.
Thank you.